Hello there. I'd like to spend today talking to you about church porches. So often they're seen as the starter of the meal, um, and we can't wait to get in them in order to get to the main course inside the church. But actually, porches have a fascinating history of their own, and I just want to introduce you to some things to look out for when you're next exploring churches. Firstly, this is something that should ring alarm bells from the start, because here we have a Romanesque arch built during the Norman period, leading into a porch. And to all intents and purposes, parish churches in this period of history didn't have porches. Some greater churches did, but not out in the country. So in this instance, this Romanesque arch was reused in the 14th century when the present porch was being constructed. The earliest porches in a parish church will date from the 13th century, and this is one of the finest examples in a village church at Great Massingham in Norfolk. You see those pointed lancets, which are so typical of the early English period. In the majority of places, porches were relatively humble, built of whatever materials you had to hand. This one at Lindsay has a stone base built of local flint and an arcaded, very rustic timber upper structure. Here's another at Shoreham in Kent. This is a little bit later. This is into the 15th century, but you see they've reproduced the tracery that's used of stone in the main body of the church to produce these wonderful wooden traceried openings. So what do we expect to find in a porch? Well, first of all, we expect to find two doors, one from the outside and one leading into the church. And the plainness or elaboration of these doorways depends entirely on what money was available at the time. We also expect a large space because this was the communal meeting place for the village. This is where you came to conduct legal transactions. This is where you came to be married, not in the church, but in the porch. And this is the reason for so many porches containing seats like these. These were for your witnesses whilst any business was being transacted. But you also expect to find a stoop which contained holy water with which you could cross yourself and say a prayer as you went into the church building. This is a particularly elaborate one at Caldicot. And you may also find an image niche for a statue or a wall painting, so that people on their way to work in medieval England could just pop into the church to say a prayer without having to go inside. And certainly in a medieval porch, you would expect to find graffiti. Many of these marks were made by people conducting transactions, so that if they broke the terms of their deal, their witnesses could bring them back and say, look, that's the mark I saw you make when you made these arrangements. Others will be left by individuals to remember the deceased. In the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people had no permanent reminder on their graves. And of course, we also get graffiti of today, children just going in there and scratching something on the walls. After the Reformation, we get lots of these, drawing around your shoe or your hand and leaving your mark, sometimes even with initials or the date you did it, permanently carved into the stone. And many church porches have carvings like these. Now, traditionally, church guidebooks have told you that these are where people sharpened arrows or knives. But if you've ever sharpened a knife, you've never done it horizontally into the wall like this. You've used a horizontal whetstone. So these are something entirely different. In fact, we now understand that these are marks left by people carving into the stone to remove some of the grains of the stone. Because these were part of a church, these grains of stone were regarded as having holy powers, and you would take them back and mix them in food or drink and give them to the sick, or keep them next to your door or your chimney piece as a ward against evil spirits. Not all porches are square and rectangular. This 14th century porch at Chipping Norton is one of the most famous in England. And the later we get in the medieval period, the more elaborate porches become. You know, these are not just the starters, they're a main course in their own respect. This is in Norfolk, and you can see above the door a Latin inscription which asks us to pray for the soul of Mr. Peace, who left money for this to be constructed in 1500. One of the most elaborate of the East Anglian porches is here at Pulham St Mary. Local flint is the stone used for construction, but it's been napped here on the porch to show its shiny middle, a very labour-intensive and expensive thing to do. And all the other stone has had to be imported from Cambridgeshire or Northamptonshire. And it includes, as you see, image niches and a row of shields just above the door, which not only show religious features, but some of those shields are blank, and they would have been painted with the shields of arms of the people who donated money. And just to prove we are in Norfolk, on the top, these wonderful carved finials include a wood rose, one of those wild men of the woods that was so popular in East Anglia. Of course, carved stone is only possible where you've got the money to use it. This is one of the bosses of the porch at Denton. It depicts the ascension. These are the apostles watching Christ ascend to heaven. And you only get these bosses where there's an upper floor in the porch. Upper floors of porches were frequently used to store the valuables, occasionally a chapel, and on rare occasions, a room for the priest to live in. At Cirencester in Gloucestershire, it's got two upper stories, and this is certainly one of the most elaborate porches built in England. You know, it's almost a building in its own right. And it's this large because it was a status symbol. On the other side of the parish church was the enormous abbey. So this was a way of showing to the people of the town that the church meant just as much business as the abbey behind. And I think it's fascinating to think of the development of porches. In the period when some small two-cell churches, that is a nave and a chancel, were the norm, when they decided to put a porch on, they took the decision to make that porch into a tower. So tower porches are not uncommon. This one's at Allington in Wiltshire. And once you've found one, if you look at other local churches, you'll find some more, because this was one of those things that people loved to copy. And just like the inside of churches, the inside of porches were full of colour. Very few remain today because so many porches were rebuilt or remodelled in the 19th century. But this one at Manorbier in Pembrokeshire still has its beautifully painted ceiling. And you find some interesting things in churches. This is a chronogram, an inscription that tells the date through its letters. This is at Brookthorpe in Gloucestershire and was put there by the rector in 1649 to record the execution of King Charles I. You see, churches are fascinating buildings to study, but so often we look at them just as a single structure. And I think By taking just the porch and looking at it in detail, we come much closer to the ordinary person than we do in any other part of the building. Thank you very much for listening.